Hey, it's Wednesday morning. I hope you're doing great. Thanks for joining us for our online devotion this morning, both in video form that you're watching on YouTube and Facebook and places like that, and some of you are podcasting as well. So thanks for joining with us as we are continuing in our bookshelf. We're looking at the different sections of Scripture and what we can learn about God through these, and it helps us better understand how Scripture is organized, so we better can know what Scripture is teaching us. So yesterday we talked to the books of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible. Today we're going to look at what's called the histories. If the first shelf on our bookshelf is the Torah, the books of Moses, the second section, what's called the histories, and that's what they are. These are books of history, and this is a longer section. This section includes Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. These books they tell the history of the Jewish people, and there's a lot happening in these sections. This section covers the most chronology. Well, probably Genesis probably covers the most chronology, but this section starts after the Exodus and continues till around the year after the rebuilding of the temple. So you're looking at 500 BC. You're looking at a 1,000-year period of history, probably. Maybe not quite that much, but it's a long series of history, because this starts with Joshua, which is where the Israelites come into the promised land. Joshua is the successor to Moses. After Moses dies at the end of Deuteronomy, Joshua takes over, and Joshua leads the people into the promised land, the conquest. The people do not fully take all the promised land. There's still parts of it that they don't have control over, and we will see throughout the rest of the Old Testament that the parts that they don't have control over will be a constant trap and a constant temptation for them. So we see Joshua telling the story of the conquest of the promised land. There are great victories and there are great defeats, and we see that Joshua is this kind of high water mark. After Joshua, we see Judges. Judges is a long book telling the stories of these judges. Judges were the individuals who God would raise up to free the people. After Joshua, the people would fall into sin. They would be captured by their enemies. They would cry out for help. God would raise up a judge. The judge would free them. They would have a series of freedom. Then the judge would die. They'd fall back into sin, fall back into slavery, and it's a cycle. It's a cycle. Slavery, sin, slavery, crying out for help, judge, freedom, sin, slavery. The cycle continues throughout the time. So it finally gets to where, well, in Ruth is a story of that happened in that time period. Ruth is the story of a Moabite woman who comes into follows her mother-in-law and eventually is redeemed and becomes part of the covenant community through the kindness of Boaz, and she becomes in the line of David. At the time, Ruth is a beautiful book. It's a short book, but it's a beautiful book that talks about God's redemptive kindness in the midst of a lot of warfare, a lot of bloodiness, a lot of sin. Ruth is a beautiful book, and I would encourage you to read Ruth. So Ruth happens during the time of Judges. Well, after Judges, there arose a judge, basically, called who's also a prophet, Samuel. And God used Samuel for a lot of great things. Samuel is raised with the priest Eli, and becomes one who follows God and leads the people. And eventually, God uses Samuel to anoint Saul first as king, and then David. So 1 and 2 Samuel follows Samuel's life and really follows the story of Samuel leading to David. And so you hear a lot of David's exploits and David's stories in the Scripture. That's going to come from Samuel. So 1 and 2 Samuel tell us a lot of David's life. After Samuel is Solomon, and then after Samuel, 1 and 2 Samuel is 1 and 2 Kings. And that basically is what happens after after David. After David, you have Saul. Saul was a good king when he was younger. Towards the end of his life, he departed from God, and the people are led astray. And then after Saul, basically the kingdom that was built by Saul after Solomon's death. So you have Saul, then David, then Solomon. After Solomon's death, because his son takes over, and the people, basically the kingdom of Israel was split in two kingdoms: the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And so First and Second Kings, as well as First and Second Chronicles, tell the story of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah. And it's a messy story. Israel, the northern kingdom, did not have a single king that followed the ways of God. Judah didn't have many. Judah did have Josiah, a few Hezekiah, a few others, but most of the kings of Israel, all the kings of Israel, most of the kings of Judah were wicked. And so First Kings and Second Kings, First Chronicles and Second Chronicles follow the stories of the kings of Israel and Judah, till eventually they are destroyed and defeated. First, the northern kingdom of Israel is defeated by Assyria. And then the southern kingdom of Israel is defeated by by Babylon. And in Babylon, they destroy the temple. They carry the leaders into exile, into the Babylonian exile. And it's in Judah that a lot of the Jewish history is formed. In Babylon, the word Judah is shortened into Jew. Much of the Jewish culture is formed during that very difficult time. So First Kings, Second Kings, First Chronicles, Second Chronicles tells the story of the kings that followed Solomon, how the kingdom was built and kingdoms fought, their wars, and then eventually their destruction by Assyria and Babylon, and them being taken into exile. Eventually, we have Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah tell the story of when Persia. Eventually, Babylon was defeated by Persia, and Persia freed the Jewish people. And Ezra and Nehemiah tell the story of the Jewish people returning from exile and their rebuilding of the temple and of the wall. So Ezra and Nehemiah tell these stories of how Jerusalem and how the kingdom was rebuilt after the exile. And then Esther, much like Ruth, is a beautiful story of God's plan of redemption. How Esther shows great courage, and the Jewish people were going to be killed while they were in exile, and she shows great courage and basically saves her people from slaughter. And it has the great passage where she is told that perhaps for such a time as this that you have been given this power and this prestige as the queen to save your people. And so the first five books of Moses get us into the promised land. Joshua through Esther lead us from the promised land into the building of the kingdom, and into the eventual destruction by Assyria and Babylon, and then eventually into the restoration after the Babylonian exile. So we see a pattern that's established actually in Judges. Judges is probably one of the more important books in this entire series, because Judges shows us that pattern of freedom to sin, to slavery, to crying out for help, for God sending a deliverer, for the deliverer bringing freedom, then back into sin. That's the story of the Jewish people all throughout this history. So these books here really are historic readings. They're very interesting to read, especially I tell the people, when I was in college, one summer I was working and I had a lot of time to read, and I read 1st and 2nd Samuel, and I'll never forget, because I really fell in love with Scripture again, reading 1st and 2nd Samuel. It really reminded me of all the truth that's in Scripture, reminded me of God's goodness, but it was just such an engaging read. So I would invite you to read these histories. These books are histories. That's what they are. So much of the history within these books has been found to be true through archaeology, through discoveries we've made. These are really wonderful books, particularly if you like history. I would invite you to take time to read these. So on the first shelf we have the books of Moses. On the second shelf we have the histories. And so these books, these first two sections really do a good job of painting for us the covenant community and the history of the covenant community. The next few sections are going to go a little bit more spiritual, if you will. Not that these parts aren't spiritual, but they're not going to be worried as much about history, or be worried about establishing characters. They're going to be worried about giving us some a little bit deeper truths and some other points and other perspectives. So I think these next few books are going to be very interesting. The wisdom literature, the prophets, things such as that. So first we have the books of Moses on the shelf. Now we have the histories on the shelf. And these together tell the story of the covenant community, the Jewish people, and their history up to this part. So join us tomorrow as we kind of dig into our next section, which is going to be the books of wisdom. Thanks for watching. Join us for Bible study. We're going to continue in our book, 8 Life-Enriching Practices of United Methodist. And we'll talk about our understanding of salvation from a Wesleyan perspective. Thanks for watching. See you tonight for Bible study at 6 p.m. and see you tomorrow morning for devotional. Thanks for joining us. Have a great day.